The sky over San Antonio de Béxar was still black when the first bugles cut the silence. From the Mexican camp, a long, mournful note drifted through the cold air the Deguello. It was the signal for no quarter. Inside the Alamo, 180 exhausted defenders stirred from fitful sleep. They had heard that tune for 13 days, but this morning it sounded different. It was closer, sharper, final. William Barret Travis, just 26, stood on the north wall with his sword drawn. "Come on, boys," he shouted. "They're coming." Beyond the darkness, 6,000 soldiers of Santa Anna's army were forming ranks, bayonets glinting in the first faint light. For a few seconds, the mission was still. Then the Mexican artillery opened fire, hurling grapeshot that tore through the adobe walls. Travis ran to a cannon and fired the first answering shot, a blast that echoed across the frozen plain. It was the last sunrise he would ever see. Below, columns of Mexican infantry advanced in silence, only the thud of boots and the jingle of gear breaking the stillness. Officers waved their swords forward. The men of the Alamo farmers, lawyers, drifters, Tejanos, Tennesseans, took their positions, each one knowing what was coming. At 100 yards, the Mexicans began to run. The defenders waited until they could see the whites of their eyes, then unleashed a storm of musket and cannon fire. Whole ranks went down. The first assault broke, soldiers stumbling over their dead and retreating into the smoke. But Santa Anna's officers drove them back with swords and curses. More ladders were raised, more men surged forward. The air was thick with powder smoke and screams. At the north wall, Travis was shot through the head. He fell backward without a sound, his sword still in hand. The defenders around him didn't even pause. They kept loading, firing, and shouting through the smoke. The Mexicans reached the walls on the third charge. Ladders slammed against stone. Bayonets flashed over the parapets. Bowie, too sick to stand, fired pistols from his cot in the infirmary. Crockett and his Tennesseans fought hand to hand at the palisade until they were overwhelmed. The chapel was the last to fall, its doors splintered by axes, its floor slick with blood. When it was over, barely half an hour had passed. The Alamo's guns fell silent. The Deguello played again, slower this time, echoing across the ruins. Santa Anna rode through the smoke, his face expressionless as he surveyed what his army had done. By sunrise, the mission that had once been a church was a grave. Bodies lay piled against the walls they had died defending. The smoke rose straight into a windless sky. No prisoners, no mercy, only silence. But the silence would not last. Within weeks, men across Texas would speak a new phrase, whispered first in grief, then in fury. "Remember the Alamo." And those words, born in the ashes of that dawn, would ignite a revolution. To understand why a ruined mission in the Texas wilderness became a symbol known around the world, you have to look beyond its walls. The fight for the Alamo wasn't just about a few hundred men standing against an army. It was about the future of two nations and the meaning of freedom itself. In the early 19th century, Mexico was still young, barely 15 years removed from its own revolution against Spain. It had won independence on the promise of liberty and federalism, but that promise was already being strangled by ambition and fear. When General Antonio López de Santa Anna seized power in 1934, he did it with words that sounded noble order, unity, strength, but his actions told another story. He abolished the Constitution of 1924, the charter that had guaranteed Mexico's states their rights to self-government. In its place, he imposed a centralized regime, stripping away the autonomy of every province from Zacatecas to Coahuila y Tejas. To Santa Anna, Mexico needed one will, one ruler, one law. To many who had fought for independence, it looked like tyranny reborn. Texas, still part of the Mexican Republic, was a frontier land of tension and opportunity. Anglos from the United States had poured in over the previous decade, farmers, traders, veterans seeking land. They had sworn loyalty to Mexico, learned Spanish, even converted to Catholicism on paper. But when the old federal constitution was torn up, the settlers and many native Tejanos felt betrayed. They hadn't come to be ruled by decrees from Mexico City. They wanted the local rights they'd been promised, their own laws, their own militias, their own voice. In 1935, rebellions flared across Mexico. The province of Zacatecas rose first and was crushed by Santa Anna's army in a storm of executions and burned villages. News of that brutality crossed the Rio Grande like wildfire. In Texas, the message was clear: surrender your rights or face annihilation. The call for resistance spread through the settlements. Gonzales, Goliad, San Felipe, and men who had once argued politics now began to clean their muskets. They didn't see themselves as conquerors, they saw themselves as the last defenders of a broken republic. When the small garrison at San Antonio de Béxar fortified the Alamo in early 1936, they weren't holding a fortress, they were holding an idea. That freedom wasn't a gift from rulers, but a responsibility carried by those willing to fight for it. The adobe walls around them were crumbling, the odds hopeless, but the principles they stood for were unbreakable. What happened at the Alamo would not only define the fate of Texas, it would define how generations understood courage, defiance, and the price of liberty. When Mexico broke free from Spain in 1821, it was a victory soaked in centuries of struggle. For 300 years, the Spanish Empire had ruled from afar, extracting silver, enforcing hierarchy, and crushing dissent. But the revolution that finally shattered that empire didn't create unity. It created a fragile dream, a vast, diverse country trying to define what it meant to be free. From the ruins of colonial rule, Mexico built a republic that promised liberty and local power, a federation of states, bound together by the Constitution of 1824. For a moment, it seemed the nation might hold. The Constitution was radical for its time. It limited the power of the central government, gave states control over their own militias and laws, and created a balance that reflected the ideals of the Enlightenment and the American model to the north. Each region, from the wealthy highlands to the remote northern frontier, could govern itself under one flag. But those ideals clashed quickly with old habits. The church still wielded enormous influence. The army, born of the revolution, remained loyal to its generals rather than the Constitution. Mexico's leaders dreamed of democracy but practiced intrigue. Out of that chaos rose a man who understood power better than principle, Antonio López de Santa Anna, a charismatic soldier who had fought against Spain and then turned on his own allies when it suited him. Santa Anna presented himself as the savior of the Republic. He promised reform, promised to defend the Constitution, and for a while, he did. But beneath the uniform and ceremony, ambition burned brighter than conviction. Once in office, he dismissed Congress, suspended the Constitution, and began dismantling the federal system that had given local governments a voice. By 1835, Mexico's dream of a federation had become a memory. States that resisted central rule, Zacatecas, Yucatan, and Coahuila y Tejas, were branded traitors. Santa Anna's response was swift and merciless. In Zacatecas, his troops massacred thousands, a message written in blood that no province would stand apart. But instead of uniting the nation, his terror fractured it. Every state that had once believed in shared freedom now feared Mexico City more than its enemies abroad. On the far northern frontier, the tension turned to open defiance. In Texas, settlers and Tejanos alike saw the same pattern: the loss of rights, the rise of dictatorship, and the threat of annihilation. What began as petitions and protests soon became a call to arms. In less than a decade, Mexico had transformed from a proud republic into an empire of fear, and in that transformation, the men inside the Alamo found their reason to fight. In December of 1835, the streets of San Antonio de Béxar shook with cannon fire and musket smoke. For 5 days, Texian rebels, farmers, merchants, and volunteers from the United States fought Mexican regulars house to house, room to room. It was urban warfare before the term existed. From rooftops and alleys, they inched forward, driving out Santa Anna's brother-in-law, General Martín Perfecto de Cos, and his troops. On the 9th day, Cos surrendered. For the first time, a Mexican garrison had fallen to the rebels. The victory felt like the dawn of independence. But Béxar was no prize, just a shattered town and a mission-turned fortress, its walls cracked by artillery and its defenders spent from exhaustion. The Tennesseans had fought bravely, but they were amateurs. Their supplies were gone, their discipline thin, and winter was coming. Most believed the war was already won. They thought Santa Anna, facing uprisings elsewhere, would never march north through the wilderness to reclaim this dusty outpost. So one by one, they went home back to farms, families, and fields that couldn't wait for spring. Only a few stayed behind. Colonel James C. Neal was left in command with barely 100 men, a patchwork garrison of volunteers, Tejanos, and a handful of artillerymen. The mission they held the Alamo was never meant for defense. Its walls were built to shelter priests and converts, not withstand siege guns. But it sat on the road to the interior, the only real gateway to the Anglo settlements farther east. Lose Béxar, and the Mexican army could march straight to the heart of Texas unopposed. Neal knew that, even if few others cared. In January, Neal begged for reinforcements, powder, and food. What he got instead were two new commanders, William Barret Travis, a young lawyer-turned-officer, and James Bowie, the frontier legend with a knife named after him. The two men didn't trust each other at first. Travis, a strict disciplinarian, Bowie, a swaggering hero of the people, but both understood that the Alamo's defense mattered. They turned the crumbling mission into a fortress as best they could. Cannons along the walls, loopholes in the parapets, trenches dug where stone had fallen away. They knew it wouldn't be enough. By mid-February, fewer than 180 men stood watch over the ruined mission. A few women and children sheltered inside, too stubborn or too loyal to leave. They didn't know that 6,000 soldiers were already on the march north, led by a general who called himself the Napoleon of the West. What they did know was simpler. Béxar was the line between tyranny and freedom, and if no one else would hold it, they would. The Alamo had been built for prayer, not for war. Long before it became a fortress, it was a Franciscan mission, stone walls rising from the scrub plain beside the San Antonio River. Its chapel, a simple ark of limestone and faith. But by 1836, the bells were gone, the altars silent, and the mission had become something entirely different, a last stand waiting to happen. Its defenders walked its perimeter each day, counting cannons, measuring powder, and knowing every inch of its cracked, sun-baked walls might soon decide their fate. The compound stretched roughly 3 acres, surrounded by adobe and stone ramparts never meant to stop artillery. The north wall was the strongest 12 feet high and thick enough to mount cannon, but the south side sagged with age, patched together with earth and rotting wood. To the east stood the chapel, its arched facade rising over the open courtyard like a scarred sentinel. To the west lay the long barracks, once dormitories for priests and converts, now bunkrooms and firing platforms. Between them, open ground, the killing ground if the enemy ever broke through. Travis and Bowie turned the mission into an arsenal. They mounted 21 cannons, old bronze 6-pounders, iron 12s, and one 18-pounder that roared like thunder. They built firing steps from rubble, raised platforms for gunners, and cut loopholes into the adobe for muskets. Every piece of scrap iron, every broken wagon wheel, became part of the defense. But for all their work, the men knew the truth. The Alamo could not withstand a siege. Its walls were too low, its enclosure too wide, its defenders far too few. Travis divided the perimeter into sectors, assigning men to the weakest points. Crockett and his Tennessee riflemen took the wooden palisade on the southern flank, a makeshift barrier of logs barely chest-high. Bowie's men held the long barracks and the low western wall. Travis himself commanded the north, where he expected the heaviest attack. The plan was simple: delay, disrupt, and hold as long as humanly possible. There was no talk of retreat. There was nowhere to retreat to. At night, the men walked the walls in silence, staring into the black horizon. Coyotes called from the river. The wind rattled through the bare mesquite branches, carrying the smell of wood smoke and gun oil. Each man knew the mission was a trap, but it was their trap. In a land of vast plains and shifting loyalties, these cracked walls had become a line drawn in stone. They were not defending a building anymore. They were defending the idea that freedom, once claimed, could not be surrendered. They came from every corner of the frontier, drawn by rumor, pride, and the hope that a stand here might matter. The Alamo's defenders were a mosaic of men, farmers, drifters, lawyers, and soldiers of fortune, all bound by a single conviction, that freedom was worth more than life. Inside the weathered walls of the old mission, their differences collided and hardened into unity. James Bowie was the first legend to arrive. A towering figure of the borderlands, Bowie had fought duels, chased fortunes, and carved his name into the rough poetry of Texas. He was half soldier, half outlaw, but his courage was unquestioned. When news came that Santa Anna was marching north, Bowie swore he'd hold the Alamo or die in it. He brought his own men volunteers from San Antonio and the surrounding ranches, many of them Tejanos, who believed Mexico had betrayed its own revolution. Their leader, Juan Seguin, stood beside Bowie, fluent in both languages and loyal to both flags, until Santa Anna's tyranny forced a choice. Then came William Barret Travis, barely 26, sharp-minded and fiery-tempered, a lawyer who traded ink for gunpowder. Commissioned by the provisional government, he represented discipline and order, the uniformed regulars of a rebellion trying to look like a republic. He and Bowie clashed instantly. Travis demanded military precision. Bowie trusted instinct and charm. Their arguments filled the courtyard for days until Bowie fell ill, leaving Travis in full command. The responsibility weighed heavily. He knew that every decision he made now would be carved in blood. Late in February, a new figure rode through the gates with a grin that could cut through smoke. David Crockett, former congressman, frontiersman, and American legend. He had left Tennessee after losing re-election with the promise, "You may all go to hell, and I will go to Texas." His arrival lifted the garrison's spirits. With his long rifle and easy humor, he became both warrior and storyteller, turning fear into laughter around the campfires. "We're all volunteers here," he told them, "and we've all got the same contract, freedom or death." Among them were the New Orleans Greys, uniformed and disciplined, the best trained men in the Alamo. They had marched hundreds of miles to fight for a cause that wasn't theirs by birth but by belief. Around them moved carpenters, blacksmiths, and settlers who'd never seen battle before. In the chapel, Susanna Dickinson and her infant daughter huddled beside the wounded, while Mexican-born defenders like Gregorio Esparza swore they would not abandon their homes to a dictator's army. For 13 days they shared the same cold nights, the same dwindling rations, and the same grim humor. Tensions flared, but so did loyalty. In the shadow of the crumbling walls, there were no more distinctions: Anglo or Tejano, officer or volunteer, saint or scoundrel. There were only men who had chosen to stand, knowing the cost, and when the bugles finally sounded in the dark before dawn, every one of them would meet it as a brother. They called him El Napoleón del Oeste, the Napoleon of the West, and he believed it. General Antonio López de Santa Anna was Mexico's president, its self-styled savior, and its executioner all at once. He dressed like a monarch and commanded like a god, convinced that destiny had chosen him to crush the rebellion in Texas personally. In the winter of 1835, while his enemies imagined him resting in Mexico City, Santa Anna gathered 6,000 men and began one of the most brutal marches in the history of the Americas. The campaign should have waited until spring. The northern plains were cold, barren, and empty of forage. But Santa Anna wanted spectacle, not strategy. He ordered his army north in midwinter, determined to catch the Texians unprepared. His columns left Saltillo in December, winding through deserts and mountains, dragging cannons and supply wagons across terrain that froze by night and scorched by day. Soldiers marched in rags, feet wrapped in animal hides, subsisting on handfuls of cornmeal and the promise of glory. As the army climbed into the Sierra Madre, snow began to fall. Horses collapsed on the icy slopes, their bodies pushed aside so the guns could pass. Frostbite claimed hundreds. Those who fell behind were left for the wolves or buried under shallow drifts of white dust. Santa Anna rode at the head, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, his staff officers mounted on fine horses. He offered no rest, no mercy, and no retreat. To him, endurance itself was proof of loyalty. By the time the army emerged onto the plains of Coahuila, nearly a third of his men were dead or deserted. Yet what remained was hardened, disciplined to the edge of fanaticism. The soldiers who survived the march were no longer an army. They were an instrument. Santa Anna knew the psychological power of fear, and he meant to wield it. When he reached the settlements of northern Mexico, he made his intentions clear. Rebellion, he declared, would be answered with annihilation. He flew the red flag of no quarter, a warning carried by rumor ahead of him. In every village, stories spread of the general who executed prisoners and burned towns that defied him. By early February, the impossible had happened. Against every prediction, Santa Anna's vanguard appeared on the northern horizon weeks ahead of schedule. The Texian scouts who saw the dust columns thought it was a mirage. No army could have crossed the winter deserts so fast. But it was real. The Napoleon of the West had come to make an example of Texas, and his timing was perfect. The men at the Alamo still believed they had months to prepare. They would soon learn that their enemy had already arrived at the gates. On the morning of February 23rd, 1836, the mist over San Antonio de Béxar shimmered with dust. From the bell tower of San Fernando Church, riders could see movement to the south columns of men, banners glinting red in the sunlight. Within hours, the quiet streets filled with panic. The Mexican army had arrived. 6,000 soldiers under General Santa Anna surrounded the town before the defenders of the Alamo could even count their number. The enemy had come faster, sooner, and stronger than anyone believed possible. Inside the mission, sentries rushed to the walls. Bowie was sick with fever, lying in a cot, but he gave orders through clenched teeth. Travis climbed the north parapet and saw the impossible, a sea of bayonets, flags, and artillery wheels stretching to the horizon. The bugles sounded the Deguello, the tune that meant no quarter. The men of the Alamo stared at each other in silence, the sound cutting through them like a blade. Then Travis shouted, "To your posts!" The gates slammed shut, and the siege began. That afternoon, a white flag appeared on the edge of town. For a moment, the defenders thought it was a truce. Perhaps Santa Anna would offer terms, allow them to surrender and live. Travis sent James Bonham to meet the messenger. But when Bonham rode close, he saw what it really was, a ruse. Behind the white cloth hung the crimson banner of no mercy. The messenger delivered a single demand: unconditional surrender. When Travis refused, the man pointed toward the Mexican lines and said, "Then none will be spared." Travis turned his horse and galloped back into the compound. He climbed to the wall again, raised a cannon toward the enemy camp, and took the lanyard in his own hands. For a heartbeat, everything was still: the smoke, the silence, the watching men. Then Travis fired. The shot boomed across the plains, smashing into a Mexican gun line and sending soldiers scattering. It was both defiance and declaration. The first cannon shot of the siege echoed over the San Antonio River, and war roared to life. Santa Anna smiled when he heard it. He ordered his artillery to answer. Shells burst against the Alamo's walls, shattering stone and filling the courtyard with dust. The defenders cheered every near miss, loading their own guns and firing back until the evening sky glowed red. When darkness fell, the bombardment continued. There would be no rest, no negotiations, and no escape. For the next 13 days, the old mission would stand alone against an empire, and every man inside it knew the clock had begun to run out. On the night of February 24th, 1836, the Alamo was wrapped in firelight and cannon smoke. The Mexican bombardment had pounded the walls all day, and the defenders were exhausted, their ears ringing, their food nearly gone. But inside a small room lit by a single candle, William Barret Travis sat at a wooden table and began to write. The ink trembled with each distant explosion. His words would travel farther than any bullet that night. "Commandancy of the Alamo," he began, his handwriting steady despite the chaos. To the people of Texas and all Americans in the world. It was not a plea, it was a statement of defiance. He described the enemy outside. Thousands of men under Santa Ana, their red flag flying as a promise of no mercy. He told how the garrison had been bombarded for days with no casualties yet, how the men were determined to sustain ourselves as long as possible. Then came the line that would outlive every man within those walls. I shall never surrender or retreat. Then, I call on you in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and everything dear to the American character, to come to our aid with all dispatch. He signed it, Victory or Death. It was not a slogan, it was a contract. The Alamo's defenders knew rescue might never come, but they refused to die quietly. Travis sealed the letter, handed it to a courier named Albert Martin, and watched him disappear through the east gate into the night. Cannon flashes lit his path as he rode eastward through the darkness, carrying the last hope of a doomed garrison. Martin reached Gonzales 2 days later, his horse lathered and bleeding. The town gathered in silence as the letter was read aloud in the smoky light of a tavern. The words struck like thunder. Men slammed fists on tables, swore oaths, and began gathering weapons. A small company of 32 riders saddled up and turned west toward the Alamo. They knew the odds, but Travis's words had stripped away fear. They were the only reinforcements who would ever reach the mission. Copies of the letter spread like wildfire across Texas. Newspapers printed it in full. Preachers read it from pulpits. Even those who couldn't read could recite its final words by heart. Victory or death became a rallying cry, a promise that liberty was worth any price. Travis never saw what his letter accomplished. He died less than 2 weeks later beneath the same walls where he had written it, but his voice, bold, desperate, and unbroken, echoed far beyond San Antonio, turning a hopeless siege into a legend that would outlive empires. By the 4th day of the siege, the Alamo's walls were holding, but its leaders were not. James Bowie, the man who had once commanded half the garrison, lay in his quarters drenched in sweat, delirious with fever. Some said it was pneumonia, others typhoid. Whatever it was, it had broken the strongest man in the fort. The knife fighter who had once stood unshaken in duels and revolutions now struggled just to breathe. From his cot, he could hear the drums of the Mexican camp and the cannons that pounded the walls. But he could do nothing except cough and whisper orders to those who came to visit. William Barret Travis, still barely in his 20s, suddenly found himself in full command. The shift was uneasy. Many of Bowie's men were volunteers, fiercely loyal to their old leader, and skeptical of the young officer from Alabama who wore a crisp uniform and quoted military regulations. Travis represented the provisional government's regular army, the discipline, the order, the structure that frontiersmen distrusted. The volunteers followed Bowie because he was one of them, rough, fearless, and human. Now that he was bedridden, the question of who commanded the Alamo wasn't just a matter of rank, it was a matter of trust. Travis handled it with a kind of quiet ferocity. He doubled the watches, ordered repairs on the walls, rationed powder, and wrote letters demanding more reinforcements. He addressed his men as equals, but made it clear that discipline was the only thing keeping them alive. Each morning he walked the perimeter, checking cannon crews, praising calm and punishing carelessness. When Bowie's followers hesitated to take orders, Travis sent word to Bowie himself. From his sickbed, the old fighter scrawled a note confirming the new chain of command. It was his final act as a soldier. That night, the men gathered in the courtyard. Crockett played a few soft chords on his fiddle. Others passed around coffee and cold bread. For the first time, the two factions, Bowie's volunteers and Travis's regulars, began to blend. They had different tempers, different faiths, and different reasons for being there. But the same horizon stared down on them all. Outside the walls, Santa Anna's army lit more campfires, their glow spreading across the plain like a rising tide. Inside, the garrison settled into an uneasy brotherhood, welded together by fear, defiance, and the knowledge that no one was coming to save them. In the dim light of his room, Bowie drifted in and out of fevered dreams. A pistol lay beside him, always loaded, his final promise to fight even from the bed if it came to that. And it would. Travis, standing on the north wall, looked toward the enemy lines and whispered the words he'd already written, "Victory or death." The command was his, now, along with the weight of every life within those walls. Life inside the Alamo had settled into a rhythm of exhaustion and fire. Each sunrise brought the thunder of Mexican artillery, each night the uneasy quiet before the next bombardment. The defenders lived in a haze of smoke, dust, and sleeplessness. Food ran low: cornmeal, coffee, and whatever cattle they had penned inside the courtyard. Water came from shallow wells choked with grit. The air stank of powder and sweat. Men joked about it when they could, but no one laughed for long. Every day the enemy guns crept closer, pounding the same walls until they shook like drums. Between bombardments, the garrison worked. Travis ordered the weakest sections of wall reinforced with earth and hides, every man hauling dirt in his hat or coat. Blacksmiths patched broken gun carriages with scrap iron. Others tore beams from the chapel roof to build new platforms for the cannons. The church bells were melted for shot. Each repair came with the knowledge that it might not last an hour under the next barrage. Yet the men kept building because as long as they worked, they believed they still had a chance. At night, small groups slipped beyond the walls to harass the besiegers. These were the night devils, men who crept into the dark, fired volleys at the Mexican campfires, and vanished before the cavalry could mount a chase. They brought back captured horses, spare powder, and sometimes wounded comrades who had fallen beyond the palisade. The sorties did little to change the outcome, but they reminded the enemy that the Alamo was not yet a tomb. Inside the walls, cheers went up each time the raiders returned. The artillery duel never stopped. The Mexican gunners fired from dawn until dusk, their shells whistling through the air and smashing into the compound with thunderous cracks. The defenders answered with their own ragged rhythm 18-pounders that shook the ground and sent shockwaves across the river. One cannonball tore through the Mexican battery and scattered a line of infantry. Another blew apart a gun carriage so close that fragments rained down over the defenders' heads. The men roared in triumph. In those moments, courage felt like victory. Crockett's company held the southern palisade, a wall of timber barely tall enough to hide behind. They slept there in shifts, rifles within arm's reach. When the guns fell silent, they played cards or told stories about Tennessee, each tale louder and bolder than the last. Crockett kept the mood alive with his dry humor, but his eyes gave him away. He knew the walls wouldn't hold forever. Each night he walked the line, listening to the distant bugles and the steady hammer of Mexican engineers building new batteries. "Boys," he'd say, "it's going to be a fine sunrise." And everyone knew what he meant. Across the river from the Alamo, the Mexican camp sprawled in ordered chaos, rows of tents, stacked muskets, cooking fires flickering beneath the stars. 6,000 soldiers slept in their ranks, though few found real rest. The cold crept through the thin canvas, and the sound of their own guns echoed all night, bouncing off the stone walls of the mission they were told to destroy. The siege was already 2 weeks old. Food was short, tempers shorter, and the smell of death rode the wind, but discipline held, enforced by the will of one man. Santa Anna moved among his troops like a monarch, inspecting subjects rather than soldiers. His uniform glittered with gold braid, his polished boots never touched mud. Officers saluted stiffly, men stood at attention, and no one dared meet his eyes too long. He demanded perfection from an army built on exhaustion. Boots shined, muskets oiled, formations precise. He knew that appearance was power. To his officers, he promised swift victory and eternal glory. To his soldiers, he gave speeches about honor and order, but also threats of execution for disobedience. To Santa Anna, fear and loyalty were the same thing. Every evening, the bugles played the Deguello, the ancient Moorish march of no quarter. Its slow, haunting rhythm rolled across the dark plain, echoing off the mission walls. The tune told both sides exactly what to expect. No surrender, no prisoners, no mercy. It was psychological warfare, a sound designed to eat at the nerves of the men inside the Alamo, to remind them that they fought not for survival, but for a legend that would end in fire. Yet it also weighed on the Mexicans who played it. The soldiers heard its fatal rhythm and knew that in the next assault, they too would die by the hundreds. In the officers' tents, the tone was different, strategic, confident, and detached. Maps were unrolled on crates lit by lanterns. Generals Castrillon and Duque argued tactics while Santa Anna listened in silence, his gloved hand resting on the hilt of his sword. They discussed ladders, columns, timing, and routes of approach. Santa Anna's orders were simple. Attack at dawn, crush the defenders quickly, and show no compassion. The assault, he insisted, must be decisive and theatrical. It would remind all of Mexico and the rebellious North that defiance led only to annihilation. Outside the command tent, soldiers whispered prayers and wrote letters home by the glow of dying fires. Some crossed themselves before sleeping. Others stared at the mission's faint outline against the night sky, listening to the faint strum of a fiddle drifting from within. The sound was almost human, almost peaceful. For a moment, the two armies shared the same silence, knowing it would be broken soon. Then the bugles called once more, the Deguello rising through the darkness, a promise and a curse. In the morning, the storm would come. While the Alamo's defenders braced under the bombardment, their pleas for help raced east across the Texas plains. Travis's victory or death letter had reached Goliad, where Colonel James Fannin commanded more than 400 men and a small arsenal of guns. He was their best hope closer than Houston, better equipped than any local militia. On March 2nd, Fannin gathered his officers and made the decision that would haunt him forever. He would march to San Antonio and relieve the Alamo. The order went out before dawn. Wagons were loaded with cannon, horses hitched, rations packed. The men cheered, believing they were about to save their brothers in Béxar. But the road to San Antonio was nearly 90 miles of swamp, sand, and broken prairie. The oxen balked under the weight, and the wheels sank deep into the mud. Fannin, a West Point man who understood logistics but not desperation, hesitated. He halted to repair a broken wagon, then another, and another. By the time his men had dragged their guns just 2 miles from Goliad, the sun was high and the heat oppressive. The march stalled, and with it, the hope of rescue. As hours turned to days, messengers arrived with grim news. The Alamo was still surrounded, the Mexican army growing stronger. Fannin's subordinates begged him to press on. He hesitated again. His heart said go, but his mind calculated odds and supplies. In the end, he ordered his men back to Goliad. The relief column never left the county line. The defenders in San Antonio would never know how close help had come, or how quickly it had vanished into the mud and indecision of one man. But not all who read Travis's letter stayed behind. From the town of Gonzales, 32 volunteers saddled their horses and rode west through the night. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and frontiersmen, members of the Gonzales Ranging Company who refused to let the Alamo die alone. The journey was suicide. Mexican patrols prowled the plains, and every creek crossing could reveal them to the enemy. They rode in silence, the hooves muffled by damp earth, guided only by the faint glow of the North Star. Before dawn on March 1st, they reached the outskirts of San Antonio. The Alamo was still standing, its walls flashing with the fire of returning cannon. The riders crept through the Mexican lines, crawling under brush and over fences until they reached the east gate. A sentry inside whispered the password, Texas, and pulled them through. The defenders roared with joy as the 32 stumbled into the courtyard, weary but grinning. It wasn't an army, but it was something more valuable, proof that someone had heard. The relief they'd prayed for had not come in numbers, but in spirit, and for a few fleeting days, it was enough. By March 3rd, the sky above the Alamo had turned a constant grey, thick with powder smoke and the dust of collapsing walls. The defenders were running out of food, nearly out of ammunition, and completely out of time. Inside the dim chapel, where the air reeked of sweat, gun oil, and candle wax, The surviving officers gathered for what would be their last council. Outside, Mexican guns thundered. Inside, the question that had haunted them since the siege began hung in the silence: do we stay or do we run? William Barret Travis stood before them, pale from exhaustion but steady. He laid out the situation in cold detail. The walls were crumbling, reinforcements would not come, and Santa Anna's army numbered in the thousands. Some of the men spoke of a breakout, a desperate night ride through enemy lines. Others suggested negotiating for honorable surrender. Bowie, too weak to rise from his cot, listened from the next room. When asked his opinion, he rasped, "If we surrender, they'll hang us all. Better to die with a gun in our hands." The room fell quiet. Everyone knew he was right. Travis drew his sword and pointed it to the dirt floor. "Gentlemen," he said, "we will not surrender. We will not retreat. We will stay, and we will fight." Then, according to legend, he dragged the sword through the dust, carving a line across the floor. "Those who will stay and die with me, step across." For a moment, no one moved. The wind whistled through the cracks in the chapel roof, and cannon fire thudded in the distance. Then, one by one, the men stepped forward. Bonham, Dickinson, Esparza, and finally Crockett, smiling faintly as he crossed. Every man followed, none stayed behind. When the last had crossed, Travis nodded once and sheathed his sword. "Then that's settled," he said simply. "We die together." The council broke apart quietly. No speeches, no prayers, no illusions. They returned to their posts with calm purpose, checking powder, cleaning muskets, and bracing the gates. Crockett gathered his Tennesseans at the palisade. Others sat in silence, writing final letters home, leaving them with the women and children who would survive to tell their story. That night, the Alamo was strangely still. The bombardment paused, the bugles fell silent. Some thought Santa Anna might be preparing to withdraw, but Travis knew better. He climbed the wall one last time and looked out over the campfires stretching into the darkness. 6,000 flames burned like a sea of stars around the mission. He whispered a single word, "Tomorrow," and stepped down from the parapet. The men who heard him nodded. They were ready. Santa Anna's plan for the morning was simple in outline and brutal in detail. A simultaneous hammering from multiple columns at first light, ladders ready, axes in hand, surge teams to rip open gates and storm the parapets. The instant any breach appeared, engineers had spent the night piling fascines and makeshift causeways where the ground was soft, hauling ladders in silence to positions that merged with the shadows. At dawn, the bugles would call, drums would beat, and waves of men would flood every approach at once. No single point to defend, only 100 small crises arriving together. The Mexicans organized themselves into columns aimed at the mission's weakest seams. One column would press the south palisade, a timber barrier barely chest-high but guarded by the fewest men. Another would hammer the long barracks and low western wall. A third would feint toward the chapel while storm parties, axes ready, struck the east gate. Cavalry and reserves waited back to exploit any collapse, while artillery kept the defenders' heads down long enough for the ladders to reach stone. It was a plan meant to swallow space, flood the courtyard with men faster than muskets could cut them down. For the defenders, the picture was stark. The north wall was the only natural strongpoint, high and thick enough to mount cannon, and that's where Travis concentrated his best gunners. But spreading 18 dozen men across 3 acres meant long, blind stretches. The palisade gave cover only to a handful. The chapel's facade, elegant and vulnerable, presented few firing steps. The long barracks' low roofline created dead ground, where the enemy could press in close and fight room to room. In short, there were fields of fire, and there were gaps no single musket could cover. Tactically, the Alamo's defenders could hold a line, but could not defend every approach simultaneously. Muskets were slow to reload, cannon could not be depressed enough to slaughter men crawling at the base of the wall, and the courtyard itself became a killing ground the moment attackers got in. The Mexicans planned to exploit that geometry, pin the flanks with feints, then jam ladders and storm the weakest seams, until the defenders were bunched and easy to overwhelm with bayonets and musket butts. What the garrison could see was the glitter of bayonets in the dim, the soft rise of engineer works, the rattling of assembled ladders. What they couldn't see was every man who would pour through at once, or the tiny breaches made by axes and engineering that would let trained infantry bypass cannon fire. The assault plan was not an elegant chess move. It was a practical arithmetic of men, timber, and timing enough bodies at enough points to make the defenders' discipline meaningless. So the Alamo prepared for shock rather than siegecraft, reinforce the weakest points, concentrate powder for desperate volleys, and pray that a single murderous defense could slow tide long enough to matter. The defenders knew the geometry of their doom, the low walls, the exposed corners, the courtyard that could not be defended if breached, and yet chose to stake everything on courage and timing, buying hours with sweat and a few stubborn cannon. Dawn would test that calculation. Before dawn on March 6, 1836, the Mexican camp came alive without a sound. In the pale starlight, officers whispered final orders, men tightened straps and checked flints. Then the bugles cut the darkness, the Deguello, slow and merciless. Columns began to move, black silhouettes against the faint horizon. Frost covered the ground. The soldiers advanced in silence, ladders on their shoulders, axes in hand, the chill of the morning mixing with the heat of fear. Inside the Alamo, sentries along the north wall saw movement in the gloom and shouted the alarm. Drums thundered, muskets cocked. The final assault had begun. William Barret Travis ran to the north wall, pulling his sword from its scabbard. Cannon crews scrambled to their posts, bare feet slipping on the cold stone. He shouted orders over the roar of drums, fire at will. The first broadside tore through the darkness, an 18-pounder spitting flame and iron into the packed ranks below. Dozens of attackers fell, their ladders splintering beneath the impact. But more kept coming, climbing over the bodies of the dead. The air filled with smoke and screaming. The Alamo had become a furnace of gunfire. 3 times the attackers surged forward, and 3 times they were thrown back, but each retreat piled the ground with corpses, creating ramps of flesh and timber that made the next assault easier. The 4th wave reached the wall. Ladders slammed into place, bayonets flashing as soldiers clawed upward. Travis fired his pistol into the face of the first man to crest the parapet, then fell as a musket ball struck him in the forehead. His body slid down the stone, his sword still in hand. The men near him saw him fall and kept firing. There was no time for grief, no room for fear. To the west, the long barracks came under assault. Mexican soldiers swarmed through gaps blown open by cannon fire, pouring into rooms thick with smoke and splintered wood. Bowie's men fought from doorways and windows until they were overrun. In the courtyard, defenders dragged smaller cannon into position, firing at point-blank range until their barrels glowed red. The geometry of the Alamo now turned against its defenders. Every wall, every doorway, every turn became a trap. Once the attackers gained a foothold, there was nowhere to fall back. As the sun's first edge rose over the San Antonio River, the fight had become chaos. Crockett's Tennesseans battled at the palisade, swinging muskets like clubs, retreating step by step toward the chapel. Bowie, too weak to stand, fired pistols from his cot until his room was filled with smoke and silence. In the courtyard, the last defenders were surrounded, fighting back to back. Musket fire echoed off the stone until it was drowned by the screams of men locked in hand-to-hand combat. When the final gun fell silent, the first light of morning spilled over the walls, and the Alamo was gone. Smoke choked the air inside the long barracks, thick as fog, lit by the flicker of musket fire and burning powder. The walls that had sheltered priests now trapped men in a maze of death. Mexican grenadiers poured through shattered doorways, their bayonets flashing in the gloom. The defenders met them with gunfire so close the muzzles scorched their jackets. For every step the attackers took, another fell, but the numbers kept coming. The narrow halls became rivers of bodies, men slipping in blood, smoke curling from cracks in the ceiling. Every room became its own small war. On the western end, James Bowie lay on his cot, half-conscious, pistols within reach. The sounds of battle rolled closer, the crash of doors, the guttural shouts of soldiers. When they burst through, Bowie raised his arms and fired both pistols. The shots echoed like thunder in the tiny room, cutting down the first men through the door. The next wave came fast, bayonets flashing. He tried to lift another pistol, but it fell from his grasp. When they found him, his blankets were scorched, his body riddled with steel. The knife that bore his name lay at his side, still unsheathed. Across the courtyard, David Crockett and his Tennesseans made their last stand near the palisade. They fought with muskets, knives, and rifle butts until the air itself seemed to burn. When ammunition ran out, they swung their rifles like clubs, shouting through the smoke. Witnesses later claimed Crockett was found surrounded by a ring of enemy dead, his coonskin cap gone, his face streaked with soot and blood. Whether he fell in the fight or was taken and executed after, no one could ever say for sure. What mattered was that he had stayed to the end, doing what he'd promised, standing his ground. In the chapel, the last holdouts gathered among the pews and altars. The wounded and dying lay side by side, listening to the chaos outside grow closer. Non-combatants, women, children, and slaves huddled behind the stone font, whispering prayers as bullets punched through the wooden doors. When Mexican soldiers finally burst inside, the fight was brief and terrible. Smoke filled the sacred space, gunfire echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The walls that once carried hymns now carried screams. And then, at last, silence. By sunrise, the Alamo was a ruin. Flames licked the edges of the barracks, and the courtyard was slick with blood. Out of nearly 200 defenders, none were left standing. Santa Anna's troops moved methodically from room to room, finishing the wounded and collecting the dead. Outside, the women and children emerged, blinking into the cold light, the living witnesses to a story that would echo far beyond the walls. The flag of no quarter still flew above the mission, but its meaning had changed. The Alamo was lost, but its defenders had made it immortal. When the guns finally fell silent, the battlefield was unrecognizable. The Alamo lay in ruins, walls shattered, smoke drifting upward like the ghost of the battle itself. Santa Anna rode through the courtyard, his horse stepping carefully among the bodies. He showed no emotion, only satisfaction. This, he told his officers, was justice. He had promised no quarter, and he had kept his word. Of the defenders, none were spared. Those still breathing were dragged before him, bayonets at their backs. A brief exchange in Spanish, a cold nod, and the executions began. In groups of 2 and 3, the wounded were lined against the broken walls and shot. Among them were men too injured to stand, propped up by their captors before the volleys fired. The sound of musketry echoed through the empty streets of Béxar, each blast a punctuation mark on Santa Anna's triumph. To him, the massacre was not cruelty, it was theater. He wanted all of Texas to see what defiance would bring. When it was over, the dead were dragged outside the mission, stacked like firewood, and set ablaze. Flames rose high above the ruined chapel, carrying the last trace of the Alamo's defenders into the pale morning sky. Santa Anna ordered a proclamation drafted that afternoon. The rebellion, he declared, was crushed. Texas would be pacified, its traitors executed, its settlements burned if they resisted. He sent couriers to every town with news of his victory, expecting the colonists to surrender in fear. But he did not understand the kind of men he was fighting. The very brutality he believed would break them instead set their hearts on fire. When the survivors Susanna Dickinson, her infant daughter, and a handful of others were released and sent to Sam Houston's camp, they carried the story with them. They told how Travis fell at his gun, how Bowie died fighting from his bed, how Crockett refused to yield even at the end. They told of the red flag of no quarter, of the executions, of the burning pyres that turned men into ash. Around the campfires of the Texian army, those stories became an oath. Soldiers whispered it first, then shouted it before battle. Remember the Alamo. The words spread faster than any army. Farmers, hunters, and volunteers came pouring into Houston's ranks, driven not by pay or politics, but vengeance. Remember the Alamo became more than a cry, it became a covenant, a promise that the blood spilled at Béxar would be repaid in kind. A month later, at San Jacinto, when Houston's men stormed Santa Anna's camp, they shouted it again and again as they charged. In that moment, the defeat at the Alamo transformed into something larger than loss. It became the heartbeat of a nation, echoing across the centuries, reminding all who heard it that freedom's price had already been paid in full. The news from Béxar struck Texas like thunder. For weeks, families along the frontier had waited for word, hoping the Alamo still stood. When the truth came that every defender was dead, their bodies burned it, ripped through the settlements like fire through dry grass. Panic followed. Entire towns packed wagons and fled east toward the Sabine River in what became known as the Runaway Scrape. Mothers carried children through the mud. Men rode beside ox-drawn carts with rifles ready, terrified that Santa Anna's army was close behind. The young republic seemed finished before it had even begun. But one man refused to panic. General Sam Houston, commander of the Texian army, received the news in Gonzales with a hard, silent stare. He understood the lesson of the Alamo. Courage alone could not win. Discipline and timing would. When his officers begged him to attack, he ordered a retreat instead. He pulled his ragged army eastward, training as they marched, forcing them to drill, to learn formation, to become soldiers instead of volunteers. He knew every mile they gave up bought time, time to gather men, time to choose ground, time to let Santa Anna make the mistake that would end him. Santa Anna, drunk on victory, divided his forces and chased Houston through the marshes and prairies of East Texas. He believed he was crushing a retreating rabble. In reality, he was being drawn into a trap. By April, Houston had drilled his army into shape rough men with new discipline and a vengeance burning in their hearts. When he learned that Santa Anna had set up camp near the marshy banks of the San Jacinto River, separated from his reinforcements and lulled by overconfidence, Houston knew the time had come to cash the moral check written at the Alamo. On April 21, 1836, the Texian army, barely 800 strong, formed in silence behind a rise of tall grass. Across the plain, 1,200 Mexican soldiers lounged in their camp, unaware that death was 30 yards away. At 4:30 p.m., Houston raised his sword. The drums began to beat, and then the roar came, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad," as the Texans surged forward. The shock was total. The Mexican army, caught asleep, collapsed in chaos. In 18 minutes, the battle was over. 600 Mexican soldiers lay dead. The rest fled or were captured. Santa Anna himself was seized the next morning, disguised in a private's uniform, his arrogance finally spent. The victory at San Jacinto was more than revenge, it was resurrection. In one furious strike, the Texian army had destroyed the might of Mexico's campaign in the north and won independence for a new republic. The cry born from ashes in Béxar had become the sound of triumph on the coastal plains. When Houston rode through his cheering men that evening, the air still thick with gunpowder and smoke, he simply nodded and said, "The Alamo avenged. The war that began in despair ended in 18 minutes, and the world would remember." When the smoke of San Jacinto cleared, the Alamo slipped from history into myth. What had begun as a desperate frontier siege became something larger, a story told and retold until it belonged to everyone and no one at once. But the truth was never simple. Behind the legend of Travis, Bowie, and Crockett were other voices: Tejano, patriots, enslaved people, and Mexican soldiers whose memories revealed a fuller, harder picture of what the Alamo really meant. For Tejanos, like Juan Seguin, the battle was not rebellion but betrayal. They had fought for federalism, not separation, believing that Mexico's 1,824 constitution had been their shield against tyranny. When Santa Anna tore it apart, they joined the revolution, hoping to restore it, not to see their homeland split in two. Seguin's cavalry fought at San Jacinto under the same cry, "Remember the Alamo," but afterward he was driven into exile by the same Anglo settlers he had helped to free. His story mirrored the fading role of Tejanos, In the New Republic, they had bled for heroes at dawn, strangers by dusk. Among the few survivors of the Alamo were the enslaved. Joe, William Barret Travis's servant, was captured and questioned by Santa Anna himself. His account, calm, precise, and unflinching, became one of the only first-hand testimonies of the final assault. He described the confusion, the noise, the smoke, and how Travis fell, leading his men. Joe was spared, perhaps because even Santa Anna knew the difference between an enemy and a captive. Yet Joe's freedom was temporary. After the revolution, he was returned to bondage. His testimony lived longer than his liberty. On the Mexican side, soldiers and officers left records of their own proud, haunted, and sometimes remorseful. They spoke of comrades cut down by cannon fire, of the horror of climbing walls slick with blood, and of the shock that followed victory. For them, the Alamo was no triumph, it was a tragedy of obedience. They had done their duty and watched history turn against them. In their letters, they wrote of respect for the defenders, calling them valientes sin esperanza, brave men without hope. Decades later, the legend began to harden into national memory. Politicians and storytellers simplified it, heroes in buckskin against faceless tyrants. In the 20th century, Hollywood turned the Alamo into a mythic stage where courage was clean and death was noble. John Wayne's 1960 film wrapped the story in patriotic grandeur, but left out the Tejanos, the Mexicans, and the enslaved who also lived and died there. Tourism followed. The mission restored, flags flying, souvenirs sold where cannon once thundered. Yet, even amid the gift shops, the real Alamo endures a place where ideals collided with reality, where courage met consequence. The legend of the Alamo will always belong to more than one people. To Texans, it is a shrine of defiance. To Mexicans, a cautionary tale of hubris and loss. To historians, it is a mirror of the nation that built itself upon it, brave, flawed, and still searching for the whole truth. Every generation remakes the Alamo in its own image, but the echo that began in those walls remains the same. Freedom, once won, must always be remembered and never taken for granted.